the craziest experiments ever performed on humans. Most people assume science has always been guided by rules and ethics. The reality was far more disturbing, because throughout history, thousands of people became test subjects in experiments they never agreed to. Some changed medicine forever. Others were so horrifying that entire laws had to be created to ensure they would never happen again. And while a few of these experiments pushed humanity forward, others crossed lines that never should have been crossed. So let's start with the strange, and slowly work our way towards the experiments that should never have existed. Number 10. The Monster Study. In 1939, researchers wanted to answer a simple question: what causes stuttering? But here's the thing. Instead of studying people who already had speech problems, they decided to create them. 22 orphan children were divided into two groups. One group received praise and encouragement. The other group was constantly criticized. Every mistake was pointed out. Every word was mocked. The children were repeatedly told that they would become stutterers. And eventually, something disturbing happened. Many of the children became anxious. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others developed speech problems that followed them throughout their lives. And all this happened because scientists wanted an answer. The experiment later became known as the Monster Study, which honestly sounds less like a scientific paper and more like a rejected horror movie. Number 9. Project MKUltra. If you thought the previous experiment was disturbing, this one was conducted by the CIA. And somehow, that sentence only gets worse. Beginning in the 1950s, the agency launched a secret program known as Project MKUltra. Its goal was simple: to discover whether the human mind could be controlled. During the Cold War, many American officials feared enemy countries had developed brainwashing techniques. So, naturally, they decided to experiment on their own citizens. Volunteers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and sometimes people who had no idea they were participating. And one substance quickly became the center of attention: LSD. Researchers secretly added the drug to drinks. Some people were given massive doses without warning. Others were monitored through one-way mirrors while they experienced terrifying hallucinations. But it didn't stop there. The project also involved sleep deprivation, hypnosis, sensory isolation, and psychological abuse. One scientist even operated several fake brothels, which sounds ridiculous until you realize what they were actually used for. The rooms were filled with hidden microphones and mirrors. Unsuspecting men were lured inside, then secretly dosed with LSD, as agents sat behind the walls taking notes, which somehow turned one of history's strangest spy operations into the world's creepiest reality show. But the consequences were anything but funny. Many participants suffered severe mental trauma. Some experienced permanent psychological damage. And because much of the evidence was destroyed, nobody knows exactly how many lives were affected. Eventually, public outrage forced investigations, and Project MKUltra became one of the most infamous experiments in modern history. But compared to what came next, things were only getting started. Number 8. The Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, a group of college students agreed to participate in what sounded like an easy experiment. 2 weeks, $15 a day, and all they had to do was pretend. Half would become prisoners. The other half would become guards. Simple. At least, that was the plan. Researchers transformed the basement of Stanford University into a mock prison. Prisoners were assigned numbers instead of names. Guards wore mirrored sunglasses. And almost immediately, everything began falling apart. The guards became increasingly cruel. They humiliated prisoners, forced them to perform meaningless tasks, and punished them for the smallest mistakes. Meanwhile, the prisoners became anxious, depressed, and emotionally broken. Several participants suffered mental breakdowns, and the experiment, which was supposed to last 2 weeks, had to be shut down after only 6 days. The most disturbing part? Nobody told the guards to behave this way. They simply adapted to the power they had been given, which raised an uncomfortable question. If ordinary people could become cruel so quickly, what exactly was human nature capable of? And the answer frightened many psychologists. Because perhaps the scariest monsters are not born. They're created. Number 7. The Milgram Experiment. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to answer a disturbing question. How far would ordinary people go if an authority figure told them to hurt someone? Now, this question wasn't random. The world had just witnessed the horrors of World War II, and many people wondered how so many ordinary citizens had participated in terrible acts. Surely, they must have all been evil, right? Well, Milgram wasn't so sure. So he designed an experiment. Volunteers were told they were participating in a study on learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher. Meanwhile, another participant was placed in a separate room. Or at least, that's what the volunteers believed. You see, the other participant was actually an actor. And every time the actor answered a question incorrectly, the volunteer was instructed to deliver an electric shock. With each wrong answer, the voltage increased. 15 volts, 30 volts, 150 volts, 300 volts, 450 volts. But here's the thing. There were no actual electric shocks. The screams, the cries, the begging, all of it was pre-recorded. But the volunteers didn't know that. As the voltage increased, many participants became visibly distressed. Some trembled. Others sweated. One man laughed uncontrollably from pure anxiety. Yet despite believing they were seriously harming another human being, most continued, not because they were cruel, but because a man in a lab coat calmly told them to continue. In the end, around 65% of participants obeyed all the way to the highest setting, which raised an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps evil isn't always committed by monsters. Sometimes, it's committed by ordinary people simply following orders. And honestly, that realization is far scarier. Number 6. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, hundreds of poor African-American men in Alabama were offered free medical care. But little did they know, the doctors had no intention of treating them. The men had syphilis, a dangerous disease that can slowly destroy the body and brain. Researchers wanted to study what would happen if the illness was left untreated. So they lied. The participants were told they were receiving treatment. But in reality, they were receiving almost nothing. Years passed, then decades. Eventually, penicillin was discovered. And by the 1940s, doctors already knew that it could cure syphilis. Problem solved, right? No, because the researchers deliberately withheld the medicine. Even as the disease spread, even as wives became infected, even as children were born with congenital syphilis. 10 years became 20, 20 became 30, and 30 became 40. For 4 decades, the men were deceived, not because scientists lacked a cure, but because they wanted more data. Eventually, a whistleblower exposed the truth. Public outrage exploded. The experiment was shut down. And the scandal became one of the reasons modern ethical standards for medical research were strengthened. But for many families, the damage had already been done, and some wounds cannot be measured in statistics. Number 5. The Soviet Sleep Experiment. Now before we continue, it's worth mentioning something. Unlike the previous entries, there is no evidence that this experiment actually happened. Most historians agree that it is nothing more than an internet horror story. But considering how many people still believe it, it deserves a mention. According to the story, 5 prisoners were locked inside a sealed chamber in the 1940s. The Soviet researchers allegedly wanted to find out what would happen if people were prevented from sleeping. To keep them awake, a mysterious stimulant gas was pumped into the room. For the first few days, everything appeared normal. The prisoners talked, read books, and carried on as usual. But eventually, things began to change. The conversations became quieter. The men grew increasingly paranoid. Some refused to speak at all. Others whispered into the microphones as if trying to gain favor with the researchers. And then, silence. For several hours, no sound came from the chamber. Fearing the worst, the scientists entered the room. And according to the story, one man refused to leave. Another supposedly screamed. And one infamous quote from the story claimed, "I must remain awake," which honestly sounds less like science. and more like something Stephen King writes after skipping bedtime. Again, none of this is real, but the fact that millions of people believed it says something interesting. Because sometimes fictional experiments can be just as terrifying as the real ones. And trust me, the next entries are very real. Number 4. The Aversion Project. During the 1970s and 1980s, the South African military conducted a secret program known as the Aversion Project. Its goal? To cure homosexuality, which is already a sentence that should make you nervous. Young men and women suspected of being homosexual were subjected to horrific treatments. Some were forced to undergo electroshock therapy. Others were injected with chemicals. And in some cases, individuals were pressured into undergoing gender reassignment surgeries without proper consent. The entire program was based on one flawed assumption, that something natural needed to be fixed. But here's the thing. There was never anything wrong with these people to begin with. Thousands suffered severe trauma. Many spent years struggling with depression and anxiety. And some never fully recovered from what had been done to them. Eventually, the truth came out, and the program became one of the darkest chapters in South African medical history. Because science without compassion can quickly become cruelty. But compared to what came next, these experiments were only scratching the surface. Number 3, Unit 731. During World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army established a secret research facility in occupied China. It was known as Unit 731, and what happened there would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. Officially, the facility studied disease. Unofficially, it studied how to kill people, prisoners of war, civilians, men, women, and even children were brought into the facility. But they weren't referred to as people. The researchers called them logs, as if they were nothing more than pieces of wood, which should tell you everything you need to know. Many prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases like plague and cholera. Others were exposed to extreme cold to study frostbite. Researchers would leave limbs outside in freezing temperatures until they became completely frozen. Then they would strike them with sticks, and if the sound resembled wood, they knew the process was complete, but it didn't stop there. Some victims were locked inside pressure chambers. Others were subjected to dehydration experiments, and many underwent surgeries without anesthesia, not to save lives, but simply to observe what happened. By the end of the war, thousands had died, and because many records were destroyed, nobody knows the true number. But perhaps the most disturbing part came afterward. Many of the scientists involved were never prosecuted. Instead, some were granted immunity in exchange for their research data, which means that for many victims, justice never came. And honestly, that may be the most horrifying experiment of all. Number 2, the Little Albert Experiment. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson wanted to answer a simple question. Could fear be created? To find out, he chose a subject, a 9-month-old baby known only as Little Albert. At first, Albert was perfectly happy around animals. He smiled at rabbits, played with dogs, and showed no fear of rats. So the researchers decided to change that. Every time Albert touched a white rat, the scientist would strike a steel bar with a hammer behind him. The loud noise terrified the child, and after repeating the process several times, something disturbing happened. Albert began to cry at the sight of the rat. But it didn't stop there. Soon, the fear spread. Rabbits, dogs, fur coats, Santa Claus masks. Anything soft and furry triggered panic. The experiment had successfully taught fear. But there was one problem. Nobody bothered to remove it. The study ended. The researchers moved on. And little Albert simply disappeared from history. Nobody knows exactly what happened to him. And because records from that time are incomplete, historians still debate his true identity. Which means somewhere behind one of psychology's most famous experiments, there was just a frightened little boy, and the world forgot him. But even these experiments pale in comparison to number 1. Because unlike the others, this experiment lasted for decades, and its victims never even realized they were part of it. Number 1, the Guatemala Syphilis Experiments. In the 1940s, American researchers traveled to Guatemala to conduct a secret study. And what they did there remained hidden for decades. The goal was simple. They wanted to test whether penicillin could prevent sexually transmitted diseases. But here's the thing. Instead of treating infected people, they deliberately infected healthy ones. Soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even children. Many of the participants had absolutely no idea what was happening. Some participants received treatment, others didn't, and many were simply left behind once the experiments ended. For decades, the entire project remained hidden from the public. Then in 2010, historians uncovered the documents, and what they found shocked the world. Because unlike many of the entries on this list, this wasn't some medieval torture or something done during a world war. These experiments were conducted by doctors, people whose job was supposed to be saving lives. Eventually, the United States government issued a formal apology. But apologies don't undo suffering, and they certainly don't bring back the people whose lives were forever changed. Conclusion. You might notice something strange about many of these experiments. Very few of them began with evil intentions. Most started with questions. Questions about disease. Questions about fear. Questions about obedience. Questions about the human mind. And questions themselves are not dangerous. But somewhere along the way, curiosity became more important than compassion. And that's when science stopped serving humanity, and humanity began serving science. Because knowledge is powerful, but power without empathy can become something terrifying. Today, every major scientific institution follows strict ethical guidelines. People must give informed consent. Experiments must be reviewed, and human rights must come first. Not because scientists suddenly became perfect, but because history taught us what happens when they don't. And perhaps that's the strangest part of all. Some of the greatest protections we have today exist because of some of the worst mistakes humanity ever made. Outro. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more strange history, dark science, and stories that reveal just how fascinating and sometimes terrifying human nature can be. And I'll see you in the next one.